Hi, this is Sandy with Daywalker Customs Embroidery, and this is Anatomy of a Wall Hanging. We're going to be taking this video from the beginning, the design of the quilt itself, all the way through doing the blocks, and those blocks will be done embroidery blocks, and then they will also be quilted in the hoop, and then the putting on of the borders, and then finalizing the quilt. So this is going to be a complete process. And as you can see here on the screen, I've got the EQ6 design that I've already done. This is electric quilt. And I created this quilt with 9 blocks in mind. They're 8.5-inch unfinished, 8-inch finished blocks. And there are 5 that are embroidery blocks and 4 that are just a quilt motif, a single color, single pass type motif. These 9 blocks will be joined together by sashing strips and cornerstones, as you can see, and then there are 2 borders. One is a piece border called Points Out, and I'll be using templates for that border. And then also the last border is just a horizontal border with cornerstones. So we'll be using this design as the blueprint going forward. So to start everything off, I needed to work on the embroidery designs themselves. So I have the embroidery designs I got from Embroidery Library. That's emblibrary.com. And it's a really good source for designs, and they're not really expensive, but they're very good quality. I've never had a bad design from them. So I'm going to use those 5 designs, actually 6 if you include the motif, to create these 9 blocks. The initial blocks, the initial 5 blocks, which are the 2 birds, the clothesline of notions, and the 2 machines, will be stitched out first. And we're going to stitch out the designs themselves with the batting and the top fabric only. And then we're going to stop before we add the stippling. And let me talk a little bit about how we did these designs. I brought the designs themselves into Hatch. Hatch is a embroidery software by Wilcom, and I used that to be able to make my kind of workspace. It's called a work area, which is in blue here, to match the 8.5-inch unfinished square size so that I would know how big my square is going to be. And then I used my big 360 by 200 hoop in order to do that 8-inch block in one hooping. So I brought the bird in this case the little cardinal, brought it in, sized it a little bit, and put it in the middle of that block. And then I used what's called ambiance quilting inside of Hatch. It's a really cool feature that allowed me to say, okay, here's my block. This is the size it's going to be finished. Here's my design. And then kind of specify how far away from the design do I want the stippling, how far away from the edge of the finished block do I want my stippling, and then kind of let it go. And it created the stippling effect around the design, which was really cool. So I saved that design, and then when I take it to my machine, I'm going to stitch the embroidery without the stippling to begin with. And I'm going to create those 5 blocks that way. And here we are beginning to stitch out the blocks, the 5 blocks. This is the first block, and I'm ready to mark the center of this block and then trim it down to 8.5, just like I did with these other blocks you're seeing now. So they've all been trimmed down, and they are ready to go into the rows that is going to be this quilt. At this stage is when I chose my fabrics that I was going to use. You could do this earlier in the process based on our design, but this is when I did it. And these 3 fabrics that you see here to the right, the one on the leftmost is the one that is going to be my light blue border. The middle one is my outer border and sashing, and then the gold are for my cornerstones and part of the border. So I chose these fabrics, and we're going to start cutting those now. I'm starting here with the sashing, and I've laid out row number 1, which has the cardinals on each end, and then the center motif block, which is not stitched yet, is plain. And then I've cut my strips 8.5 by 1.5 so that it will come out a 1-inch finished sashing in the middle. We're going to put each row together in this fashion. So I'll end up with 3 rows with the sashing in the middle of each of the blocks. Once our rows are put together, we're actually going to add the sashing to the top and the bottom of each row, with the exception of the 3rd row. So I'm showing you row number 1 here, where I've pinned the sashing to the top. I haven't sewn it yet, but I have sewed the sashing on the bottom. Once I've completed row number 1, I'm going to attach it to row number 2 with sashing in the middle. And then I'm also going to put the sashing on the bottom of row number 2. But we're only going to do the first 2 rows that way. The 3rd row is only going to have the sashing on the bottom because we'll be attaching that row to the sashing that's on the 2nd row. But we won't want to do that yet. The reason that we are only going to attach 2 rows together is so that when we take it to the embroidery machine and we're actually going to do the quilting with the stippling, that we're going to only have 1 row that we will work across, and then we can turn our hoop, turn the designs upside down and turn our hoop and do the other row across. Otherwise, there'll be too much bulk to try and get it through the embroidery machine to actually do the quilting. So by limiting it to 1 row that it's going to be working on, flipping it around and doing the other row, we save that bulk between the hoop and the machine. So, and it worked out pretty well. One thing I really like about my Baby Lock machine is the fact that it has a camera on it. Some of the newer embroidery machines have this, and mine happens to have it. What it allows me to do is actually tell it to take a picture of my fabric that's in my hoop and display it up on the screen, and then I'm able to take the actual design that is on my screen and move it around until it's centered or it's over where I've already stitched. So in this picture you can see my sashing and you can see that I've got my fabric and block underneath, but what you don't see is that the design itself is actually over the top of where I have stitched underneath. So I can line it up and I know exactly where my stippling is going to go within that block, and I know where it's going to go around the design that I previously stitched. And then once I get it all lined up and it's ready, then I tell the machine to just do the stippling stitch because I don't want it to do the rest of the embroidery. Just do the stippling stitch, and then it does that, and the block turned out really good. So here's a picture of that block once it was done stippling. The next block to stitch out here is the motif, the single pass 1-color quilt motif. And that was on the blank piece of fabric that was in the middle of the 2 that are going to be stippled. And so here you can see the 3 of them together. So row number 3 is complete with the stippling and the motif in the center. And now my quilting is complete for these 9 blocks. Here's the middle row. So you've got a motif on each end with the stippling clothesline in the middle. And then my cardinals here on each end of the top row with the motif in the middle. And then the final cardinal here. So my quilting is finished, and now I'm ready to put my rows together. As we put row 2, the sashing from row 2, connected to the top of row 3, we want to only sew it to the sashing itself. So you're going to connect the row 3 sashing to sashing. So you're going to roll back the batting and the backing so that it's out of the way and pin it just to the sashing. You're going to take it to the machine, and then what it'll do is it'll finish off the top, kind of leaving the back kind of open, which is what you want because we need to put the backing and the real batting on the back to finish it. So, but you'll want to put these rows together And by doing just the top sashing, you're going to get that finished look on the front. When I finished the rows, I trimmed row 3 even with the sashing all the way around. But when I trimmed row 1 and 2, I trimmed the sides and the top even with the sashing, but I left about 2 to 3 inches of the batting and the backing fabric where I was going to connect row 3 to row 2. And here actually is where I'm showing I removed the excess batting. So I made sure that I kind of laid the batting out, got it flat, cut the excess out. And then I take the backing and I'm actually going to flip it over here, give it about a 1/2 inch seam. I put some steam seam in there to hold it closed. And then I'm actually going to fold that flap over and then hand stitch it down so that I don't have any top stitching going through to the front of the fabric. And you're going to close this seam just like you would a binding with a kind of a blind stitch. And there is our finished top, the quilted top with the sashings. So you can see all 9 of the blocks are finished. They're quilted through the layers of batting and backing. And our center is complete at this point, and now we're ready to move on to the borders. So this first border is actually cut from templates. So you can see my pieces are here that I've already cut for my inner border. And once I piece those together and make 4 of those border pieces, I'm going to attach it to the quilt just to the sashing only. Again, we're just working on the top here. We're not going to go through all layers. And so we're going to fold the batting and the backing out of the way when we pin our border to the sashing, because we just want it to complete the top. We're working on the top layer now, so keeping the quilted portions out of the way. Um, and so we're going to pin that on, and we're going to do it on all 4 sides, and 2 of the sides will have those corner blocks in them as well. So you're going to have 4 that are one length, and then 2 of them that will have the 2 cornerstones on the end for the top and the bottom. This is actually a picture after I've put those borders on where it's only attached to the sashing. You can see from the back that I have not attached it to the batting or the backing, that it was just attached to the sashing. And now I have my first border in place. We're going to repeat the process with the second border, just adding the second border to the first border. Again, it's going to be easier because there's not really any batting or backing to have to fold away when we're attaching those borders. So we'll do the sides first, which will be the plain darker color blue, and then we'll add the top and the bottom, which will also have the gold cornerstones in each of the center, on each end. And then once that's done, this is what your top will look like with both of the borders. The next piece that we're going to do is actually work on the back. Similar to how we did the front, we're going to cut pieces of batting and backing to fit the back, to make the back as big as the front plus 2 inches. So we're going to start with just the sides, and the sides we're going to cut the length, exactly the length of the quilted center. But we're going to make the width be 2 inches wider than our border. So in this case, I cut an 8-inch wide by 28.5-inch long strip for each side. I then attached those sides to just the backing fabric. Again, not going through all the layers, just to the backing fabric itself. And then I was able to have the 2 backing pieces on the sides of the quilt. Then I cut the top and the bottom, which would be again 8 inches because I wanted it 2 inches bigger than the borders, but as long as the quilted center plus how much I had for the backing on each side. So it ended up being about 8 inches by 43 inches because it was, again, the quilt is 39, and so I had about 2 inches on each side of that. So it ended up being about 43. So then after I have attached the backing to the sides, then I attach the backing to the top and the bottom. Again, just the backing alone. And now you can see here I have a picture of how the top and the backing are kind of laying together, and our next step is going to be to sandwich that batting in between. As we start to lay the batting in between the two layers, the top and the bottom, we want to butt it up really closely to the already finished quilted center. And then you're going to see here that I used 505 spray and actually sprayed the batting to hold to the backing fabric, and then sprayed the batting again to hold to the front fabrics. So now I've kind of made my sandwich. I've finished my sandwich all the way around my quilt, so that it's almost like we didn't have separate pieces. And even if you look at the back, of course, I had to use a little bit different fabric for my top and bottom because I kind of ran out. But even if you look at the back, it's pretty seamless how it's put together. Especially if you use a busy back like mine was, you can rarely even see the seams. And so now we have our quilt sandwich all put together, and we can go and take this to the machine and stitch in the ditch for the borders, or do whatever we want to do quilting wise to the borders. And then once we finish the borders, we're going to trim it off just like we normally would, put our binding on, and hand close our binding. And so this is a picture of the finished quilt with the binding on, and we have gone from the very beginning design phase all the way through creating this with embroidery and even quilting in the hoop, and then putting our borders on and finishing this quilt. So that is anatomy of a wall hanging, and I hope that you enjoyed this video, and we'll come back and see some of my other videos. Thanks.